The following video is part of our APUSH study program. For more study materials, go to opaeducation.com and sign up now. You know, Landon, French tanks during World War II had rear view mirrors so they could see the front lines. That's a really thoughtful joke. I hope you appreciate it. In Unit 6, we discussed how the US grew in size and in its economy after the Civil War. In Unit 7, we will discuss rising political tensions relating to issues of imperialism, isolationism, and the role of government in the economy. In Unit 7, the topics being covered are as follows: imperialism, the Spanish-American War, progressivism, World War I, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, FDR, World War II, and post-war relationships. Yes, this unit is very stacked with a lot of different things, so pay attention, and you might learn something. During the late 1800s to early 1900s, America became a force within the Western Hemisphere, departing from its isolationist tendency. There were multiple reasons for America to pursue imperialism. First, the new economic growth meant that Americans were looking for areas for both resources and markets. Second, many Americans subscribed to questionable racial beliefs, like the white man's burden or social Darwinism. The white man's burden was the idea that it was the responsibility of white people to civilize other cultures, and social Darwinism was the idea of survival of the fittest race, i.e., whatever race was the fittest should dominate the others. Third, many Americans looked at European imperialism in Asia and Africa, and wanted to both compete with and emulate the Europeans. Imperialism had its critics, though. Conservative Democrats and some progressives formed the American Imperialist League in response to the end of the Spanish-American War. But opponents of imperialism didn't all have the same justification for their beliefs. Some thought imperialism was anti-American, as they were bringing people into the empire with no intention of having them participate in the democratic system. Others were so racist that they didn't want to control other races for fear that it might change American demographics. The Spanish-American War is a perfect example of American imperialism. Spain occupied Cuba in the 1800s and were absolutely brutal to the Cubans, killing them and putting them in concentration camps. Americans sympathized with the Cubans, and many called for American intervention. The catalyst for the war was the sinking of the USS Maine in the Havana harbor. U.S. media was quick to blame the explosion on the Spanish despite not having any evidence. America beat the Spanish in 25 days and signed the Treaty of Paris to end it, not to be confused with the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution. In the treaty, America gained the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Cuba gained its independence, but in the Platt Amendment in the Cuban Constitution, the U.S. maintained the right to militarily intervene in Cuba and give the U.S. Guantanamo Bay. The Filipinos resisted American rule and fought a long and deadly war against America for independence, but ultimately lost, and the Philippines would remain an American colony until after World War II. In the previous unit, we mentioned that the populist movement grew in size and scope across the U.S. After the Panic of 1893, which was by far the worst depression in U.S. history at that point, the loosely related progressive movement was born. However, it didn't have the same solid base and defined goals that the populist movement did. By that I mean, it was made up of many different interests of moderate reformers in society, everything from regulating business to reforming bureaucracy to social justice to welfare. Progressives were such an ideologically diverse group that they were even divided among many issues like prohibition, segregation, birth control, suffrage, and immigration. Progressives had many different methods for advocating for their policy ideas. Progressive journalists, particularly, were very vocal in fighting against what they saw as corruption or social injustice. They were known to investigate politicians and corporate leaders and leak disparaging information about them. Within law, the progressive Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes believed that laws needed to be interpreted to modern society, and this was reflected in many of his opinions for the court. Reformers set up organizations and worked as volunteers to help fix some of the important problems they saw in society. Progressives hoped, on a national level, to effectively regulate the economy, expand democracy, and create moral reforms. This was reflected in the 16th through 19th Amendments. The 16th Amendment allowed for an income tax. The 17th Amendment created the popular election of senators. The 18th Amendment was the prohibition of intoxicating liquors, and the 19th Amendment gave women the vote. This was also reflected in the presidents from the early 20th century, people like Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. As president from 1900 to 1908, Republican Teddy Roosevelt was very progressive, especially in his regulation of the economy and his conservationist policies. Teddy Roosevelt was big on presidential power to accomplish his square deal. Just a disclaimer, there are going to be a couple of deals in this unit. So the square deal was Teddy's domestic agenda, which basically centered around the conservation of parks and wildlife, controlling corporations, and helping consumers. He envisioned a balance between labor and corporations, which is why he was known for using force to help labor unions and break up trusts. He strengthened the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, signing into law many bills that allowed the ICC to regulate railroad prices and break up large corporations. He was also a big proponent of the conservation movement, setting aside funds to protect national parks and wildlife across the U.S. Republican William Howard Taft was elected in 1908 and was basically an extension of Teddy, but Taft did more trust busting than Teddy did, which basically means he would go after trusts and corporations and break them up. In the 1912 election, Teddy Roosevelt decided to return to try and win the White House again, but Taft secured the Republican nomination. Teddy then started his own party, which split the Republican vote, giving Democrat Woodrow Wilson the presidency. Woodrow Wilson was peak 20th century progressivism. He reformed so much he made Roosevelt look like a wimp. He drastically lowered tariffs right away with the Underwood-Simmons tariff bill in 1913. Then he moved on to the domestic economy and financial regulation. He signed a bill into law that created the Federal Reserve System known as the Fed. It was made up of 12 regional banks and a central Federal Reserve Board in D.C. Members of this board would be appointed by Wilson, and we still have this system in place today. The board could regulate credit and change the money supply. He also created the Federal Trade Commission to oversee business activity. And lastly, he signed into law the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthened regulation against large trusts. As for his foreign policy beliefs, Wilson believed that words were more powerful than armies. He wanted to spread American beliefs, but he also wanted to find new markets for the U.S. economy. The defining moment of his presidency was World War I. For the majority of World War I, the U.S. remained neutral. Ever since Washington outlined his policy of neutrality, America had resisted interfering in non-Western hemispheric European conflicts. Woodrow Wilson outlined the idea of freedom of the seas, the idea that the seas should not be controlled by any particular country. He wanted America to sell weapons to both sides of the conflict, but because Germany had been blockaded by Britain, the U.S. could only sell weapons to Britain. This both connected the U.S. closer to Britain and irritated the Germans, who were not receiving U.S. weapons. In response, they began sinking U.S. ships with submarines. The sinking of the Lusitania, a British ship carrying 2 Americans, pissed off many Americans. It is often wrongly cited as the catalyst for the U.S. entry into World War I. Germany issued the Sussex Pledge, vowing not to destroy any passenger ships. In 1917, America intercepted the Zimmermann Telegram, a communication between Germany and Mexico in which Germany promised to give Mexico the land it lost in the Mexican-American War if Mexico entered the war on Germany's behalf. Germany also revoked the Sussex Pledge and restarted unrestricted submarine warfare. Later, in 1917, the U.S. would enter the war. Wilson cited humanitarian and democratic reasons for entering the war, as Americans began viewing the Germans as ruthless killers. The federal government would exert more control during the war, and 4 new agencies were created. First, the War Industries Board coordinated the allocation and purchase of war supplies. Second, the Food Administration was in charge of giving the troops enough food. Third, the National War Labor Board dealt with labor, making sure that workers and owners got along so that they could produce goods for the war. Fourth, the Committee on Public Information was created to influence public opinion on the war. Yeah, I know, sounds pretty Orwellian, doesn't it? The American troops known as the American Expeditionary Forces had a limited role in the war, but it helped tip the scales of history in favor of the Allies. When the U.S. entered, the war was at a stalemate, so American troops played a role in pushing the Germans back and ending it. Woodrow Wilson used the post-war period to expand U.S. influence across the world, as Wilson was very involved with diplomatic talks. He drafted up his 14 points, which outlined his vision for a world with free trade, self-determination, democracy, and international cooperation. The only one of his points that actually came to fruition was his proposal for an international organization to deal with conflict in the form of the League of Nations. But isolationists in the Senate prevented the U.S. from joining it. The U.S. Senate also didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles. While the U.S. might have broken its isolationist tendencies going into the war, coming out, the U.S. still remained isolated from world affairs. The war had a profound impact on American life as well. The controversial nature of the war and the Russian Revolution led to a rising fear of radicalism. In response, Congress passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts. These acts targeted people speaking up against the war or hindering the war effort. In Schenck v. United States, a famous Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court ruled that free speech that created a clear and present danger to the U.S. could be regulated, and thus, Schenck, a socialist who had passed out pamphlets urging people to resist the draft, could be jailed.
And now a word from our sponsors.
Do you know why I'm at the beach right now with Elmo? Because I used opaeducation.com to study for my APUSH test. It saved me time and money. So for a more affordable, engaging, and efficient method to study for your APUSH test, go to opaeducation.com and then join me at the beach. I'm waiting. Culturally, Americans became scared of both German and Russian culture, and many English words with German roots, like hamburger, were renamed. Culturally, the U.S. continued to shift as well. As the U.S. continued its large transition from a rural agricultural economy to an urban industrial one, more and more people moved into cities. By 1920, a majority of Americans lived in urban areas which offered new economic and social opportunities for people, especially for immigrants looking for jobs. The war created migrations to urban centers, as factories were looking for more workers. The United States accepted more Mexican immigrants, and many settled in American cities. World War I also marked the beginning of the Great Migration, as many African Americans migrated north to work in factories and escaped the Jim Crow South, where violence against African Americans was prevalent. But Northerners still discriminated against African Americans and treated them as lesser citizens. One good thing that came out of this migration was a distinct formation of black culture in America. Especially as African Americans moved into places like Harlem and New York, literature, song, dance, and art movements were born, expressing ethnic identities in a number of different ways. Following the war, as with many post-war recoveries, the U.S. experienced a production and productivity boom. New technologies such as steam turbines, electric motors, and conveyor belts both increased the productive capacity of the U.S. economy and increased the standard of living for all Americans. Consumers had more spending power and prices were dropping. Construction companies experienced massive growth as cities began building skyscrapers and large residential buildings. Automobiles became more widely available and accessible. By 1929, 20% of the U.S. had a car, which is huge. This was in part due to the Model T Ford car, which became cheaper after Henry Ford began using conveyor belts to increase production. The economy overall allowed for greater mobility and communication for people across the U.S. Greater mobility allowed for mass immigration in the early 1900s, resulting in a growing nativist movement in the early 1920s. This culminated in the National Origins Act of 1921, which reduced immigration to 350,000 people. This hit Asian immigrants hardest because Europeans were prioritized. Quotas were cut again in 1924 to only allow 150,000 immigrants in per year. Mass media also began to take shape and influence the culture of America. Movies became big, and theaters drew tons of people. Radio popped up in the early 1920s as well, which allowed for more entertainment and a greater dissipation of news. It is also important to note that by 1920, Prohibition was in place. This created a black market for liquor, which led to a rise in gangs and gangsters such as Al Capone. Bootlegging occurred on a massive scale as well. As mentioned in the previous unit, the United States was transitioning from an agricultural economy to an industrial one. The panics of 1893 and 1907 began to raise the question of how much control the government should have over the economy. But both of these economic downturns would be outdone by the Great Depression. Historians and economists still dispute the causes of the Great Depression, but three explanations are frequently cited. First, some argue that overexpansion and underconsumption promoted the Depression. While the economy grew during the Roaring Twenties, some argue that the increase in the wealth gap prevented many working Americans from consuming the goods that were now being mass-produced, like the new cars and radios. Second, banks began to gamble on the stock market with borrowed money, which magnified economic risks tremendously. Third, some U.S. industries began to decline. Workers in the textile, coal, mining, and railroad industries were laid off, and agriculture took a huge hit. After the war, farmers continued to produce at wartime numbers, causing the price of farm goods to significantly decrease. Lastly, what historians call economic dumbness played a role in the Depression. The Fed did a bad job of regulating the money supply and lowered interest rates. American tariff policy was also highly corrosive to trade between America and Europe. On what is known as Black Tuesday in 1929, the stock market crashed, causing Americans who had invested in the market to lose a lot of money. The unemployment rate hit around 30%, and Americans had to stand in line for food at the worst points of the Depression. And the Depression would spread overseas, hitting Germany hard and creating the conditions for Hitler's rise to power. Herbert Hoover assumed the presidency in 1928, just a year or two before the Great Depression would be in full swing. He was a traditional politician who believed in balancing the national budget and cutting taxes to increase the public spending power. In order to force consumers to buy domestic goods, Congress passed the largest tariffs in American history to this date, with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. This absolutely decimated world trade to the U.S. and was at least partly responsible for the spread of the Great Depression to other countries. Although Hoover became more open to major policy changes later in his presidency, they were not enough. The only issue of the 1932 election was the Great Depression. Hoover was pitted against Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR won in a landslide with 58% of the vote and a solid Democrat win in Congress. When FDR stepped into the Oval Office, the unemployment rate in the U.S. was at roughly 30%. His plan of attack against the Depression was called the New Deal. This is the other deal we were talking about. It was centered around two things. The first New Deal was centered around providing relief for the people of the U.S. The second New Deal was focused on reforming the current system in place. The first New Deal, as I said, was a package of policies centered around relief. That's big. Remember that. Relief. It's going to be on the test. Relief. First New Deal. In terms of saving the banks, new legislation ensured bank deposits, bailed out banks, and regulated their ability to speculate. Bank speculation is basically when a bank buys an asset it hopes will grow in value. So there's some risk there. In order to help the unemployed, new legislation provided mortgage relief to millions of Americans who lost their homes. There were also policies designed to create jobs, to expand highways and other public works projects. The last major part of the first New Deal centered around agriculture. This was also incredibly important because the Dust Bowl had ravaged agricultural communities across the plains. Legislation gave the government the power to pay farmers to leave their fields empty so the prices of those goods would increase. This would provide a cushion for farmers to continue working. In addition, the government set up loan funds for farmers so they could continue producing food. The second New Deal, as I said, centered around reform. Remember that. Reform, second New Deal, reform, second New Deal, reform, second New Deal. That's going to be on the test. You better remember it. These legislative actions created wealth taxes, regulated the banking industry even more, limited the size of utility companies, reformed pensions, and strengthened unions. The most notable legislation, the one that really changed the U.S., was the Social Security Act of 1935. This bill shifted the perception of the U.S. from a mostly laissez-faire country to a capitalist country with a welfare system in place. Social Security is still in place today. While many unionist and populist groups praised these policies and even pushed for radical regulation and change, conservatives in Congress opposed them, and some of the New Deal was struck down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. FDR's response to the Great Depression also drove a school of economic thought known as Keynesian economics. Fathered by John Maynard Keynes, Keynesians believed that the government should increase spending and cut taxes to end an economic depression. These ideas would be used countless times since the 1930s. The New Deal also helped FDR form a large coalition of voters, which helped him glide to the presidency in 1936, 1940, and 1944. He pieced together traditional Southern Democrats, white blue-collar laborers, and urban minority groups. Most notably, black voters began voting reliably Democratic for the first time. Unfortunately, though, the New Deal did little to actually stimulate the economy and rebuild it. Much of the hype around the New Deal is overstated, as reflected by the estimated GDP growth and unemployment numbers of the 1930s. However, its psychological impact on the population cannot be overstated. Americans felt hopeful as they looked to get out of this dire situation. FDR's fireside chats helped connect with Americans and bring resolve to the people. Additionally, the repeal of Prohibition in 1933 was a large step in helping Americans for a number of different reasons. So what really pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression, you ask? Well, there's a relatively simple answer to that question. World War II. The road to World War II started in the 1920s. During the 1920s, the United States had a relatively isolationist foreign policy. In 1928, the U.S. and 62 other countries signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war. Geniuses, real geniuses. This pact did nothing. Next, FDR's good neighbor policy, aimed at changing the U.S.'s relationship with its Western Hemisphere neighbors, focused on trade and cooperation rather than intervention. For example, FDR changed the Platt Amendment with Cuba. The rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, and the expanding Japanese empire threatened America's isolationism. Debates between isolationists and interventionists were reignited as war broke out in Europe. The U.S. used the cash and carry policy to send weapons to the British on British ships so as not to risk American lives. But as the Nazis began conquering Europe, more and more Americans began supporting intervention. But war would come to them with the attacks on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Soon after, the U.S. entered the war. Mobilizing the military and economy to fight World War II helped bring the U.S. out of the Great Depression and would help the U.S. win the war as well. The United States enacted multiple policies to ensure the success of the war effort. First, goods like food and gas were rationed. Second, the U.S. began selling war bonds, which were basically loans from people to the government. Third, FDR created the War Production Board and the Office of War Mobilization to coordinate and organize private industry. Fourth, FDR created the Selective Service and drafted Americans into the military. Socially, the war provided more opportunities for women and African Americans. Because there was a shortage of labor, women began to work in factories and take jobs typically given to men. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of women empowerment. As African Americans gained more influence in industry and in the military, they fought back against discrimination. In addition, the war helped draw attention to the dangers of fascism and racism at home and abroad. During the war, migration to the United States from Mexico increased, and Mexican workers helped the U.S. war effort. But the war had a significant negative effect for Japanese Americans. Through executive order, FDR forced 100,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. FDR and the Supreme Court believed that Japanese Americans were a national security threat and used that fear to justify discrimination, civil liberty revocal, and terrible treatment of Japanese Americans. By the time Congress declared war, the world was in shambles. France was cowering with their cheese and baguettes. In December of 1941, there was no guarantee the Allies would win at all. Hitler had begun his invasion of Russia. As the U.S. looked around, the only country it could really count on was Britain. But Britain was being bombarded nightly by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. And Japan was in full force in the Pacific. This formed the basis of the Big Three: Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and FDR. Americans believed in the fight. They saw it as a struggle between the forces of democracy and freedom over the forces of totalitarianism and militarism. Soon after the U.S. joined the war effort in full force, the Allies saw three major wins that marked the turning points in the war. In northern Africa, the Battle of El Alamein marked the first Allied win in the battle against the Axis powers. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway was a U.S. win over Japan. This win re-established U.S. control over the fight and pushed the Japanese into retreat mode. But most importantly, the Russian win over Germany at Stalingrad pushed the Germans back on the Eastern Front. In the Pacific theater, the U.S. used the method of island hopping, which involved going from island to island in the Pacific and driving out Japanese forces. By July of 1943, Allied forces had pushed the Axis out of Africa entirely and began moving into Sicily and Italy. In 1943, as war raged, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill met in Tehran, Iran. At the conference, they planned D-Day. Stalin promised to declare war on Japan after defeating the Germans, and they outlined what would eventually become the United Nations. In June of 1944, the most important day of the war occurred. The Allied invasion of Normandy, also known as D-Day, was a successful landing of Allied troops in northern France. This opened up a western front, and with the help of the Russians in the east, Berlin was taken less than a year later, marking the end of the war in Europe. In April of 1945, FDR died and Truman assumed the presidency. At this point, Japan hadn't been defeated in the West. The U.S. had secretly been working on the creation of atomic bombs. This was known as the Manhattan Project. Faced with the possibility of needing to invade Japan, Truman decided to drop one bomb on Hiroshima in Japan and another on Nagasaki a few days later. Japan surrendered immediately, but people soon started questioning the use of atomic bombs in war. A large part of the Allied victory were the technological advancements made during the war. Most notably, radar and sonar were integral in detecting other ships, planes, and even German U-boats. Of course, the discovery of nuclear fission was integral as well, as it paved the way for the atomic bomb. The makeup of the U.S. Army was very diverse. It featured every possible kind of American, regardless of race, gender, or sexual orientation. Although the Army was still segregated, military service provided women and minorities many opportunities for socioeconomic advancement. The U.S. emerged from World War II the most powerful nation on the planet. They and their fellow Allied powers were in charge of rebuilding the world. In 1945, the Big Three, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill, met again at Yalta. They agreed to divide up Germany after the war into 4 zones, each to be controlled by an Allied power. Stalin also agreed to hold democratic elections in Poland after the war, but that never happened. Finally, in 1945, following the death of FDR, Truman, Stalin, and British Prime Minister Clement Attlee met in Potsdam. They planned the denazification of Germany, particularly the Nuremberg Trials. At the Nuremberg Trials, many Nazis were convicted of war crimes like the Holocaust and sentenced to death. Now, if any of that sounded new to you, you should go back and look at your notes and textbooks for those sections. But if you feel confident with that information, consider answering and outlining the following review questions. First, what characterized progressivism? Second, what factors launched the U.S. into World War I? Third, what shifts did the U.S. make in its foreign policy from the year 1900 to 1925? Fourth, how did the Great Depression affect Americans socially, economically, and politically? Fifth, compare and contrast the difference between the first and second New Deals. Sixth, what caused World War II? Seventh, to what extent did the progressive movement actually accomplish its goals? And eighth, what factors contributed to the end of the Great Depression? Good luck studying. I'm out. Oh, hi. Didn't see you there. That was me in the video. My name is Ben. If you enjoyed the video and want to quiz yourself on the information, go to the OPA Education website, opaeducation.com. Sign up for the OPA free plan and take the Unit 7 quiz right now.